Among the many books of the Bible filled with dramatic events, seas parting, fire falling from the sky, prophets proclaiming judgment, the Book of Ruth arrives like a gentle breeze. Seemingly simple, yet deeply profound. There are no miracles here, no voice from heaven. The story begins with the quiet sorrow of a single family forced to leave their homeland because of famine, and yet, in this very ordinary setting, a greater picture of God's providence and covenant faithfulness slowly begins to emerge. The events take place during the time of the Judges, a chaotic era when, as Scripture tells us, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21:25. Amidst this spiritual and social disorder, the Book of Ruth shines like a silent star, not through power or conquest, but through loyalty, kindness, and the restoration of hope. We are introduced to Naomi, an Israelite woman who, along with her husband and 2 sons, leaves Bethlehem in search of survival in the land of Moab. But tragedy follows. Her husband and both sons die, leaving her alone with her 2 foreign daughters-in-law. It seems as though Naomi's story is ending in bitterness until a small light breaks through, not a heavenly vision, but the tender, heartfelt vow of her Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth. "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." Ruth 1:16. From that moment on, Ruth, a widowed foreigner with no possessions, no status, and no security, embarks on a journey of faith. She travels with Naomi back to Bethlehem into an uncertain future, and yet it is this quiet act of loyalty that opens the door to a larger divine purpose. Soon, Ruth meets Boaz, a distant relative of Naomi. He is not only wealthy, but a man of integrity and compassion. As Ruth begins gleaning in his fields, a quiet symphony unfolds, each small interaction revealing the subtle intervention of God. What seems like coincidence is actually divine orchestration. Boaz protects Ruth, provides for her, and eventually accepts the role of kinsman redeemer, marrying her to preserve Naomi's family line. What makes the Book of Ruth extraordinary is not only its moving narrative, but its surprising revelation. Ruth, the foreigner, becomes the great-grandmother of King David and ultimately a part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Matthew 1:5-6. It's a stunning reminder that God's grace knows no boundaries of race, status, or circumstance. Ruth does not shout with signs and wonders, it whispers through the actions of everyday life. No miracles are mentioned, and yet the precise coincidences leave no doubt. The hand of God is quietly at work. It's in the silence of heaven that his most profound work often unfolds through the faithful hearts of those the world might overlook. And we're left to wonder, could it be that the most ordinary, uneventful days of our lives are actually the very ground where God is preparing something extraordinary? Come with us into the fields of Bethlehem, where sorrow is met with compassion, where loss gives way to joy. The Book of Ruth is a tender reminder that God never forgets those who put their trust in him, no matter who they are or where they come from. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to explore more meaningful, soul-stirring stories from the Bible. To truly understand the depth and meaning of the Book of Ruth, we must step back in time, not to an age of peace and prosperity, but to one of chaos, fear, and spiritual confusion. Ruth's story unfolds in the era of the Judges, a dark chapter in Israel's history when the people had no central ruler and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. It was a time marked by moral decay, tribal wars, and frequent disobedience to God's covenant. This backdrop of societal collapse makes the opening of Ruth especially poignant. The narrative doesn't begin with a great battle or a prophetic vision, but with a famine. The irony is sharp. Bethlehem, literally the house of bread, is without food. But this is no ordinary food shortage. According to the covenant warnings laid out in Leviticus 26, and Deuteronomy 28, famine often accompanied spiritual rebellion. When Israel turned from God, the land itself cried out in drought and desolation. In response to this crisis, a man named Elimelech takes his wife Naomi and their 2 sons away from Bethlehem to the land of Moab, a decision heavy with spiritual symbolism. Moab, a nation born from an incestuous act, Genesis 19:36 through 37, was seen as morally compromised and even cursed in Israelite law, Deuteronomy 23:3 through 6. This wasn't just geographic relocation, it was a spiritual detour. Their hopes for refuge are quickly shattered. Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi widowed in a foreign land. Her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, but after a decade, both men die as well. Now 3 widows are left in a vulnerable, uncertain future. In a society where a woman's protection and place were tied to her male relatives, Naomi's situation becomes one of utter loss, not just of loved ones, but of legacy, security, and social standing. Naomi's decision to return to Bethlehem is filled with bitterness. She tells those who greet her, "Do not call me Naomi, pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Ruth 1:20-21. Her grief is raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. But then, in the quiet of her return, the story hints at a new beginning. She arrives at the start of the barley harvest, Ruth 1:22, a small detail yet filled with promise. Harvest signals hope, provision, and the beginning of restoration. And here we meet Ruth, one of the most extraordinary characters in the Bible. A Moabite by birth, she chooses to leave her homeland and gods to follow Naomi and embrace the God of Israel. Her words echo through time, "Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God." Ruth 1:16. It is an act of radical loyalty, courage, and faith. What follows is not a dramatic miracle, but a series of providential events so subtle they could be missed, yet so perfectly aligned they reveal God's hand. Ruth begins to glean in the fields and just happens to find herself in the land of a man named Boaz, a relative of Naomi. Boaz, full of quiet strength and integrity, notices her faithfulness and offers her protection and kindness. Their interaction unfolds with a beauty that mirrors the turning of the seasons, from the emptiness of famine to the fullness of harvest. Through Boaz, a path opens not just to provision, but to redemption. He steps in as a kinsman redeemer, marrying Ruth and securing Naomi's family line. This quiet, personal redemption ultimately leads to a royal legacy. Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of King David, and through David's line comes the promised Messiah, Jesus Christ. The Book of Ruth, though only 4 chapters long, is a masterpiece of divine storytelling. In a time when prophets were silent and God's presence seemed absent, we're reminded that his hand was never withdrawn. He was working, not through spectacle, but through simple faith, daily kindness, and unwavering love. In a world filled with noise, Ruth calls us to pay attention to the quiet, to see God in the ordinary, to believe that even in our own seasons of loss and spiritual drought, he is preparing a harvest of hope. Amid a time marked by chaos and spiritual confusion, the story of Ruth unfolds, not separate from the turmoil of Israel's dark period under the judges, but as a thread of divine grace quietly woven through it. National instability, moral decline, and personal heartbreak are not just the backdrop. They are the soil from which this deeply human and divinely guided story springs forth. As we step into the first chapter of Ruth, we're not met with spectacle or miracles, but with the sobering reality of famine and migration. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Ruth 1:1. This opening line does more than set a historical scene. It encapsulates a spiritual drought just as real as the physical one. Bethlehem, ironically named House of Bread, is empty, and so Elimelech, whose name means, "My God is king," takes his wife Naomi and their 2 sons to Moab, a land fraught with theological tension and historical baggage for Israel. Their decision, while seemingly pragmatic, whispers of spiritual compromise. The narrative doesn't offer overt judgment, but the consequences unfold with quiet weight. Elimelech dies, and his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, take Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. 10 barren years pass, then both sons die. Naomi is left in a foreign land, bereft of husband, sons, and the future they represented. The silence of God through this passage is palpable, echoing Naomi's inner desolation. And yet, amid this silence, a flicker of hope. Naomi hears that the Lord has visited his people and brought food back to Bethlehem. Ruth 1:6. This brief mention of divine action signals a turning point. With nothing left to anchor her in Moab, Naomi begins the journey home, accompanied by her daughters-in-law. What follows is one of the most emotionally charged scenes in all of Scripture. On the road, Naomi, full of grief and self-blame, urges Orpah and Ruth to return to their families and gods. Her speech is steeped in sorrow and theological despair. "The hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Ruth 1:13. She sees herself as cursed, too old to hope, too broken to offer a future. Orpah, in tears, eventually turns back. But Ruth remains. What she says next reshapes the entire narrative and history itself. In words echoing covenantal language reserved for God's faithfulness, Ruth pledges her life to Naomi and to Israel's God. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Ruth 1:16-17. This is not mere sentiment, it is a radical renunciation of identity, security, and personal ambition. Ruth is not simply loyal, she is transformed. A Moabite woman, from a nation excluded from Israel's assembly, Deuteronomy 23, now walks the path of faith more boldly than many Israelites. Naomi, numb with grief, and perhaps unable to grasp the depth of Ruth's vow, says no more. Together they walk on in silence. As they arrive in Bethlehem, the town stirs. The once pleasant Naomi returns a shadow of herself. "Can this be Naomi?" the women whisper. She answers bitterly, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Ruth 1:20. Her honesty is painful and raw. She acknowledges God's sovereignty, but not his goodness. She believes her story is one of emptiness, but she cannot yet see what God is beginning to write. The final verse of the chapter is deceptively quiet, but full of promise. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Ruth 1:22. This single detail, barley harvest, signals the arrival of a new season, both literally and spiritually. As grain ripens in the fields, so does the unseen plan of God. Ruth, the foreigner, will become the key to redemption, legacy, and the royal line of David, and ultimately to the coming of Christ. Chapter 1 of Ruth is not just the beginning of a personal recovery story. It is a revelation of how God works through pain, through exile, through loyalty and quiet faith. Redemption is not always loud or instant. Sometimes it begins on a dusty road with bitter tears and a vow spoken in the shadows. And though Naomi cannot yet see it, hope is already walking beside her. As we step into chapter 2 of the Book of Ruth, the tone shifts subtly but profoundly. The silence of sorrow that cloaked Naomi and Ruth begins to lift. Though grief still lingers like morning mist, a new chapter opens, not with grand miracles, but with small acts of courage and the gentle unfolding of divine provision. The scene moves from a house of mourning to open fields shimmering with both grain and grace. And with that shift comes a new character, Boaz. He isn't introduced with fanfare, but his presence is unmistakably significant. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Ruth 2:1 ESV. It's almost a narrative whisper, planting a seed in our minds. Who is this man? Why does his name matter? The text offers no immediate answers, only a sense of expectancy. Boaz is described in Hebrew as a Gibor Chayil, a man of valor, strength, integrity, and influence. This phrase doesn't merely suggest wealth, it implies moral character and leadership rooted in covenant living. And most importantly, Boaz is a relative of Elimelech, placing him in a position of potential redemption through Israelite customs, the concept of the kinsman redeemer. But Ruth and Naomi don't know any of this yet. What they do know is that they need to eat. With Naomi's consent, Ruth sets out to glean in the fields, an act permitted by Mosaic law to support the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner. Leviticus 19:9 through 10. Ruth's request is modest, even timid. Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Behind her words, though, lies remarkable bravery. She, a Moabite and a widow with no social protection, chooses to step out in faith, unsure of how she'll be received. And then the storyteller gives us a quiet wink. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Ruth 2:3 ESV. The original Hebrew reads more like, her chance chanced upon, a poetic irony hinting that what appears accidental is divinely arranged. God is present, not in fire or thunder, but in timing, location, and hearts inclined toward kindness. When Boaz arrives, his greeting to his workers, "The Lord be with you," sets him apart. He's not just a wealthy landowner, he's a man who carries his faith into the workplace. His leadership is rooted in reverence for God, and it shows. Boaz notices Ruth immediately, not just her appearance, but her story. He's heard of her unwavering loyalty to Naomi and her decision to leave Moab behind. When he speaks to her, it's with tenderness and protection. "Stay here in my field. I've told the men not to touch you. Drink from the jars the workers have filled." These are not empty gestures. They are radically compassionate in a culture where foreign widows often went unnoticed, or worse, mistreated. Then come words that touched the soul. "The Lord repay you for what you have done, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth 2:12. This imagery, taking refuge under God's wings, is a deeply rooted biblical metaphor for divine protection and belonging. See Psalms 91:4. In using it, Boaz not only acknowledges Ruth's faith, but affirms her place within the covenant community of Israel. Ruth, overwhelmed, responds with humility. She cannot understand why such favor is extended to her, a foreigner. But Boaz goes even further. He invites her to eat at his table, offers roasted grain, and instructs his workers to leave extra grain for her. By the end of the day, Ruth returns to Naomi with an ephah of barley, an astonishing amount. It's no longer just survival, it's abundance. Naomi's response is telling. The woman who once renamed herself Mara, bitter, now bursts forth with a blessing. May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Ruth 2:20. For the first time since her return, Naomi recognizes that God's covenant love, chesed, is still active. Her heart, once hardened by grief, begins to soften in the face of mercy. The mention of Boaz stirs a shift, not just in circumstance, but in spiritual awareness. And yet, the chapter doesn't close with resolution. Ruth continues gleaning in Boaz's fields throughout the harvest season under his quiet care. No promises have been made. No declarations of love. But hope. Hope is taking root. Chapter 2 is more than a narrative transition. It's a theological hinge. It turns us from the bitterness of chapter 1 toward the anticipation of redemption. Through the structure of Israelite law, the gentle strength of Boaz, and the unwavering faith of Ruth, we are reminded God is not silent. He is working quietly, powerfully, and faithfully in the background. As Ruth bends in the sun, gathering grain with no knowledge of what's to come, we, the readers, sense what she cannot. The Redeemer has entered the field. As the days of harvest unfold with gentle regularity, the relationship between Ruth and Boaz quietly grows stronger. Their connection is built not on grand declarations, but on consistent acts of kindness, mutual respect, and shared integrity. Boaz continues to protect and provide for Ruth, allowing her to glean in his fields through both the barley and wheat harvests. Yet despite this ongoing care, a lingering question remains. What about the future? Ruth and Naomi, still widows in a patriarchal world, are secure for now but lack lasting protection and a restored lineage. As the second chapter closes, we feel a subtle tension. Provision has arrived, but redemption is still out of reach. Sensing that this window of opportunity may soon pass, Naomi, once silent and sorrowful, steps into a role of wisdom and agency. Her words in Ruth 3:1 mark a turning point not only in the story, but in her own journey. "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you that it may be well with you?" Naomi, once resigned to bitterness, now acts with hope. She sees the divine fingerprints on Ruth's encounter with Boaz and recognizes that something sacred may be unfolding. Naomi's plan is both tender and strategic. She instructs Ruth to prepare herself, not for seduction, but for a symbolic gesture rooted in Israelite custom. Ruth is told to bathe, anoint herself, and wear her best garments, actions that signal a transition from mourning to new beginnings, from widowhood to readiness for covenant. She is to go to the threshing floor where Boaz will be winnowing grain, a space that is public by day but private by night. While potentially open to misunderstanding, this setting is chosen with care. Ruth is to observe quietly, then approach Boaz after he has eaten and lain down to rest. She is told to uncover his feet and lie down, a culturally understood request for covering, protection, and in this context, a proposal of redemption. What happens next is among the most intimate and spiritually charged moments in all of Scripture. Ruth follows Naomi's instructions with quiet courage. As Boaz awakes startled in the night, he asks, "Who are you?" Ruth 3:9. Ruth's response is both humble and bold. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." These words are powerful. Ruth is not asking merely for marriage, she is invoking the responsibility of the kinsman redeemer, a role defined in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25, in which a close relative marries the widow of a deceased kin to preserve the family name and inheritance. More than that, her language echoes Boaz's own blessing in Ruth 2:12, when he prayed she would be sheltered under the wings of the God of Israel. Now, Ruth asks Boaz to become that shelter. The beauty of this scene lies in its quiet reversal. Ruth, a Moabite woman and a foreigner, takes initiative with dignity and honor, approaching Boaz not for personal ambition, but for the sake of family and covenant. In return, Boaz does not act with suspicion or superiority. Instead, he is deeply moved. He praises Ruth not for her appearance or charm, but for her character and loyalty. "You have shown more kindness now than before by not going after younger men," he says, Ruth 3:10. He sees in her something rare, a heart of hesed, the covenantal love marked by steadfastness and sacrifice. Yet the story doesn't resolve here. Boaz reveals that there is another man, a closer relative, who has the first right to redeem Ruth. Out of respect for the law and the family structure, Boaz refuses to act prematurely. But he also makes a vow, "If he will not redeem you, then as the Lord lives I will." Ruth 3:13. Boaz sends Ruth home before dawn to protect her reputation, understanding how easily honorable acts could be misunderstood in a society bound by strict customs. Before she leaves, he gives her 6 measures of barley, a gesture rich in meaning. This is not only provision for the day, but a symbol of his commitment, not just to Ruth, but to Naomi and her household. When Ruth returns and shares all that has happened, Naomi, now filled with calm assurance, speaks with the wisdom of one who has seen God's hand at work. "Wait, my daughter, until you see how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest but will settle the matter today." Ruth 3:18. This moment is a sacred pause, a breath before redemption, a quiet interlude where human faithfulness has been offered and divine timing must now unfold. Chapter 3 of Ruth may not feature miracles or dramatic displays of divine power, but it is deeply spiritual. It reveals how ordinary acts, faithful obedience, wise guidance, respectful pursuit become instruments of God's greater plan. The threshing floor, usually associated with work and separation, becomes in this story a place of covenant and renewal. Here, we don't just witness a romantic union, but a turning point in salvation history. For from this union will come a child, from that child a line that leads to King David, and from David a path that leads to Christ, the Redeemer of all. In this sacred night where love and law meet under the stars, we are reminded that God often works not in loud wonders, but in quiet faithfulness, that sometimes the smallest acts of courage shape the greatest stories of redemption. As the story of Ruth draws to its final chapter, the narrative rhythm quickens. What began as a soft, sorrowful tale of famine, exile, and loss now accelerates toward a joyful and redemptive resolution. Chapter 4 opens not with sentiment, but with swift and deliberate action. Boaz, having made a vow of redemption to Ruth, steps into the public square to fulfill his promise, not merely as an individual act, but within the full view and authority of the community. This pivotal scene takes place at the city gate, a place not just of comings and goings, but of governance, justice, and social responsibility in ancient Israel. Legal matters were settled here, and Boaz arrives not in hesitation, but in confidence, ready to finalize what divine providence has already set in motion. The narrator tells us, Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. Ruth 4:1 ESV. The use of "behold" here is rich with significance. It's not mere coincidence, but a subtle cue that something bigger is unfolding. The unnamed Redeemer appears at just the right moment, as if summoned by destiny. Boaz presents the matter before 10 elders, ensuring proper legal witnesses, and begins with a straightforward offer. The closer kinsman has the right to redeem Elimelech's land, an appealing opportunity. In Israel, land was sacred, part of God's covenant with his people, and a vital thread in the fabric of family heritage. At first, the man agrees, but then Boaz adds a key condition. The day you buy the field, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his inheritance. Ruth 4:5 ESV. The tone shifts. What once looked like a gain now appears as a sacrifice. The unnamed man, fearing the implications for his own inheritance, withdraws. I cannot redeem it for myself. Ruth 4:6. And so he disappears from the story, his name never recorded, perhaps a quiet judgment on his refusal to embrace covenantal duty. Boaz, in contrast, rises as a man of integrity and devotion. In the presence of the elders and the community, he declares his intent not only to redeem the land but to marry Ruth, saying, "You are witnesses this day." Ruth 4:9-10. This moment is not only a legal act, it's a deeply theological one. Boaz steps into the role of redeemer, echoing the very heart of God, who defends the widow, restores the broken, and brings life from what was thought lost. The people respond with blessing, not a generic wish, but a profound invocation. They say, "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah." Ruth 4:11. These are the mothers of Israel, pillars of the covenant community. To compare Ruth, a Moabite woman, to them is more than acceptance, it is exaltation. She, once an outsider, is now honored as a matriarch in the lineage of promise. The people also speak of Perez, the son of Judah and Tamar, Ruth 4:12. This deliberate reference draws a striking parallel between Tamar and Ruth. Both women, through bold choices in difficult circumstances, ensured the preservation of a family line. Their stories, though unconventional, are woven into the fabric of redemptive history. The narrative then reaches its long-awaited crescendo. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Ruth 4:13. This is the only moment in the entire book where God's direct intervention is acknowledged by the narrator. After so much silence, divine action is now unmistakable. The child born is not just a blessing to Ruth and Boaz, it is a restoration for Naomi. The women of the town, who once heard Naomi lament that the Lord had made her life bitter, now gather around her with praise. "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. He shall be to you a restorer of life." Ruth 4:14-15. In a poetic reversal, the woman who came home empty now cradles fullness in her arms. Naomi becomes a nurse to the child, named Obed, meaning servant or worshipper. And then the book concludes with a short genealogy, but this list carries a thunderous message. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. What began as a story of two widows surviving loss becomes the origin of Israel's greatest king. And more than that, the foundation of messianic hope. As the Gospel of Matthew later records, Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Matthew 1:5-6. Ruth, a foreigner and once a widow, becomes one of the few women named in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Ruth 4 is not just a conclusion, it's a revelation. It shows us that God's work in the world often moves through the ordinary, through land, lineage, marriage, and motherhood, through choices made in silence, through acts of faith when all seems lost. It reminds us that redemption does not always come with trumpet blasts. It often begins in barley fields, in quiet vows, and in the hands of those willing to love faithfully. In Ruth and Boaz, in Naomi's joy, and in the legacy of Obed, we see that God's redemptive plan is never hindered by loss. Instead, He brings beauty from ashes, inclusion from exclusion, and kings from common soil. And from the fields of Bethlehem, humble, unseen, and holy, the story of salvation continues. As the Book of Ruth reaches its final chapter, what unfolds is far more than a touching resolution or a tale of romantic fulfillment. It is a multi-layered portrait of divine involvement, a spiritual and theological masterpiece quietly woven through everyday lives. Beneath its modest length lies a message that spans centuries, a message that continues to speak with urgency and hope to a modern world in need of redemption. Though it begins with loss, famine, and brokenness, the story concludes with legacy, restoration, and purpose. This journey from emptiness to abundance is no accident. It's a deliberate unfolding of God's providence, a theme that runs like golden thread through every verse. What stands out is how God's providence is not flashy or loud. It doesn't come through thunder or miraculous intervention. Instead, it moves silently, often imperceptibly, through what might seem like ordinary events. A woman gleaning in a field, a landowner showing kindness, a widow returning home. When Ruth happens to glean in Boaz's field, Ruth 2:3, the author hints, with clever irony, that this is no coincidence. The original Hebrew suggests her chanced upon, a poetic reminder that what we see as luck is often God's hand at work in the background. This quiet guidance speaks volumes to our own uncertain lives. When things feel random or out of control, Ruth reminds us that God's purposes are never at the mercy of chaos. He is always at work, even when he seems silent. Equally powerful is the theme of hesed, the Hebrew word for loyal, covenantal love. Ruth's devotion to Naomi expressed in her iconic vow, "Where you go, I will go, your people shall be my people, and your God my God," Ruth 1:16, is a defining example of this sacred love. It's not driven by sentiment but by commitment. Ruth chooses loyalty not for reward but out of a deep sense of faithfulness, even when the future is uncertain. This kind of love, steadfast in suffering and unwavering in cost, challenges us today. In a world where loyalty is often exchanged for convenience, Ruth's actions invite us to ask, what does it mean to love when it's hard? Are we willing to stand by others when the path offers no guarantees? Another vital theme is inclusion, God's gracious embrace of the outsider. Ruth, a Moabite woman and descendant of a people long viewed with suspicion, Deuteronomy 23:3-6, is not just welcomed, she is woven into the very lineage of King David and ultimately Jesus Christ, Ruth 4:17-22, Matthew 1:5. This is nothing short of revolutionary. It tells us that in God's redemptive plan, faith outweighs background and trust matters more than bloodline. This truth resonates deeply today, especially as societies wrestle with issues of belonging, migration, and exclusion. Ruth's story asks us, do we see the foreigner and the stranger as burdens, or as beloved participants in God's unfolding work? Redemption itself, another central motif, is both legal and spiritual. Boaz fulfills the role of Goel, kinsman redeemer, not merely by purchasing land or securing a family name, but by stepping into someone else's brokenness and offering restoration. His actions mirror, in quiet foreshadowing, the work of Christ, who redeems us not because he has to, but because he loves us. Through Boaz we glimpse the heart of Jesus, the one who steps into our pain, lifts us out of despair, and restores what was lost. His redemption isn't abstract theology, it's deeply personal, bringing healing and hope to real people with real wounds. The book also elevates character. Ruth's integrity, humility, and perseverance shine through her every decision. Boaz, too, displays compassion, restraint, and justice, not just in public, but in private moments when no one is watching. Their lives show us that righteousness is not merely about rituals or reputation, but about how we treat others when no one's keeping score. In a time when public virtue can be performative and private compromise rampant, the Book of Ruth quietly insists that integrity still matters. Character counts. And godliness isn't outdated, it's transformative. But above all, Ruth is a book about hope. Hope that does not erase suffering, but transforms it. Naomi's journey from calling herself bitter, Mara, to becoming a joyful grandmother cradling new life, Ruth 4:16, is a powerful reminder that pain is not the end of the story. The same God who allows sorrow also brings renewal. Her emptiness becomes abundance, her despair becomes a legacy. And in that child born to Ruth and Boaz lies the promise not only of restored family, but of a coming Messiah, the true Redeemer, who will one day make all things new. For modern readers, the applications are as rich as the story itself. Ruth calls us to live lives of courage and compassion, to extend grace to those on the margins, to walk in quiet obedience when the way is unclear. It reminds us that God often works through small decisions and hidden sacrifices, and it reassures us that in His time, every act of faith, every step of love, every seed sown in righteousness will bear eternal fruit. In the end, the Book of Ruth isn't just the story of a woman, a man, or a family. It's the whisper of the gospel, wrapped in barley fields and lullabies, inviting us to believe that our Redeemer is near, and that through Him, even the most broken places can become sacred ground. As the story of Ruth reaches its conclusion, we are left not merely with a satisfying ending, but with a lingering echo, a profound reminder that continues to resonate in the hearts of those who read it with open eyes and a listening spirit. What begins with famine and displacement gradually unfolds into a miraculous journey of divine providence, covenant love, and multi-generational redemption, not through mighty kings or powerful prophets, but through the quiet faithfulness of seemingly ordinary people. The power of the Book of Ruth lies in its prophetic paradoxes. A foreign woman becomes the matriarch of Israel's royal lineage. A woman once filled with bitterness and loss now holds in her arms a child of renewed hope. And a humble act of gleaning in a field becomes the beginning of a redemptive story for all humanity. Each detail, from Ruth's bold vow in chapter 1, Ruth 1:16-17, to Boaz's honorable response in chapter 3, Ruth 3:10-13, and culminating in the birth of Obed and the genealogy leading to David, Ruth 4:17-22, is more than a touching romantic arc. These are sacred pieces in a larger story of divine love, the story of a God who sees, remembers, and redeems. Throughout the book, God never speaks audibly. There are no dramatic miracles, no thunder from heaven, and yet His presence is unmistakable, quiet but powerful. The silence of heaven is not the absence of God, but an invitation to faith, to trust even when answers have not yet come. Ruth receives no prophecy, sees no sign, yet she chooses loyalty, she chooses love, she chooses trust, not because she is certain, but because she believes in a God she has only just begun to know. And it is through such simple, sincere acts that God's plan begins to grow, like seeds hidden beneath the soil. Boaz stands as a remarkable example of a righteous man, unpretentious, not seeking recognition, but living uprightly, obeying the law, protecting the vulnerable, and acting with truth. His role as Goel, the kinsman redeemer, does more than preserve one family from extinction. It points forward to a greater redeemer, one who would not just rescue a lineage, but redeem the entire world. Thus, the structure of the Book of Ruth does not simply lead to an ending, it leads to fulfillment. A messianic hope begins to blossom right there in the fields of Bethlehem. And in that very place, centuries later, a child would be born, one who would also be called the Restorer of Life. So then, what are we, today's readers, to do with such a story? If we treat it as merely an ancient tale, we will miss its living message for the present. The Book of Ruth doesn't just call us to admire its characters, it calls us to become like them. Be like Ruth, who crossed cultural boundaries, chose love with no guarantees, and followed a God she had only seen through the life of another, yet trusted with her whole heart. Be like Boaz, who didn't wait for society's approval to act, but responded immediately with compassion and justice. And be like Naomi, who, though once shattered and bitter, eventually opened her heart to hope and discovered that even in emptiness, God was preparing a new legacy. Ultimately, this story turns our gaze toward Christ, the greater Boaz, the Redeemer, who did not hesitate to save us, even when the cost was his very life, the one who found us when we were still strangers and welcomed us into his covenant family. Like seeds sown in a field, he brings forth a harvest of eternal life for all who trust in him. As the Apostle Peter wrote, "For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." 1 Peter 2:25. Ruth's return was not merely geographical, it was spiritual. And her story stands as an invitation to each of us to return to God, the one who is always there, watching each step, ready to weave even our deepest losses into a legacy of grace. The fields of Ruth are not far from us. They stretch into our own decisions today, into every moment where faith is called to rise amid uncertainty. So let us step into those fields, not only to gather but to give, not only to receive, but to become a reflection of that same love, a love that from generation to generation is still redeeming. The story of Ruth does not end simply with a genealogy or the birth of a child. It ends with hope, a quiet yet powerful reminder that even in our darkest days, God is still at work. He was not only rewriting the stories of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, he is also writing your story if you are willing to believe, to love, and to walk forward in faith. The Book of Ruth is a testimony that even the smallest actions, the quietest choices, and the most overlooked people can play an essential role in God's great redemptive plan. If this video has encouraged or inspired you, please click like to help share this message of faith and hope with others. And if you'd like to continue discovering rich, meaningful stories from the Bible with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming faith journeys. Thank you for joining us. May God richly bless you and your family. See you in the next video.